So what we're looking at today is conflict, specifically colonial conflict that is going to occur after English settlements become more established. Now, we've seen that it's been there from the outset, but we are going to explore what happened when Native Americans as well as English settlers began to clash with one another. Recall that tobacco becomes the cash crop of Jamestown. Since settlers can own private property, they can then plant tobacco to try and earn a profit and thus earn a living. Well, tobacco exhausts the soil, so they move further inland. They move onto lands that are controlled by the Powhatan. Now, there is still hostility that lingers from raids that were conducted under the leadership of John Smith. And in 1618, so about a decade after Smith is forced to go back, a little over a decade after Jamestown is settled, Chief Powhatan dies, and leadership falls to his brother, who hates the English. He's still very bitter at them for their actions, but he bides his time. Now, about 4 years after Powhatan's brother takes over, there's about 4,500 settlers in Virginia, which is the overall colony, but 2,000 of them are in the main settlement, which is Jamestown. Now, bear in mind that of these 4,500 settlers, 10,000 had been transported from England by this time. So the mortality rate is still very high. Now, the leader of the Powhatan, Chief Powhatan's brother, pretended to convert to Christianity. That's a theme that we see throughout a large portion of what becomes American history. Settlers trying to convert Native Americans to Christianity. So Powhatan's brother pretended to convert, led the English into a false sense of security. In a very coordinated attack, 350 English settlers were killed. That's men, women, and children. The survivors gather at Jamestown, and the natives killed all livestock and burned the plantations. The retaliation involved the English waiting until just before the corn harvest, and then they destroyed native villages and their crops. They destroyed their crops just before the harvest so that it would be a very lean winter. And the next May, England pretended to want peace, so they held negotiations where they poisoned the drinks of 250 Powhatan who attended, killing them all. So we see that both sides understand how to attack the weaknesses of their enemy. In the particular case of the English, they've been through this before. They are schooled in centuries of brutal warfare, winner-take-all total war. So they understand how to go after all parts of the enemy. Now, things heat up in 1644. I mean, there was peace about 10 years after the initial Powhatan attack, but then the conflict began escalating once again. This time, in 1644, the Powhatan stage another attack and kill 400 colonists. This time, the English counterattacks were absolutely vicious. And by the time he was captured, because Powhatan's brother was captured a few years after this second attack, he was 100 years old, nearly blind and crippled, but he still led his people. But when he was captured, he was killed by a vengeful English soldier. At this point, the two sides came together and the English basically forced the Powhatan to sign a treaty where they were forced to give up massive amounts of land. This sets the tone that land will be the main issue between the two sides. In this case, the Powhatan, but in other instances, Native Americans have it. The English want it, they'll do what they feel is necessary to get it. And in many cases, it comes at the cost of native lives. So looking at Jamestown is a great place to start in understanding conflict. Now, the first major conflict, we're talking large scale, were between the English and the Pequot. The Pequot are in what's now modern-day Connecticut, but they're the most powerful tribe in their region because they control the coast, which means they control the wampum. Eventually, it's not just about trade, it's about land. We even see it here. English desire for land. And this turns into this first major conflict. Now, the issue is that since the Pequot are powerful, they have plenty of enemies. So the English allied with the Mohegan and the Narragansett because those two tribes wanted to see them fall. This culminated in an attack on about 400 Pequot at their main village on the Mystic River. This is often referred to as the Massacre at Mystic. There were 400 people, 400 Pequot in the village, 5 survived. 5 out of 400 survived. And even the native allies of the English they were shocked at the brutality that the English displayed. Of the 3,000 Pequot before the war, only half survived. And those that did survive became subjects of the Mohegan and Narragansett. Now we see here, emphasized need for Native unification. There is no collective Native American identity at this point. It's very similar to how there was no collective African identity, hence you had different kingdoms competing with each other. In this sense, you have different Native American tribes competing with each other. About 5 years after the Pequot War ended, there was a Narragansett Sachem who proposed an alliance of Native Americans, but the idea fell apart. So we start in New England with the Pequot War. It's all about land. Next, we move to what's commonly referred to as King Philip's War. Now, King Philip's War centers on an individual known as Metacomet. He's a Sachem of the Wampanoag, so he's one of their leaders, the son of a man named Massasoit. His people had enjoyed relative peace with the English, so we're talking all the way back to Plymouth. But in 1675, it was shattered. 3 Wampanoag were tried and hanged by Plymouth colonists. They murdered them. Well, the colonists had murdered a Wampanoag who was a colonial informant. So basically, this guy's a spy. So what ends up occurring, that's where English provocation comes from. The English hanged a spy. Wampanoag warriors began to loot and burn settlements. And neutral bands like the Narragansett were even drawn into the conflict. Now, the English referred to Metacomet as King Philip. That's why it's King Philip's War. And the English settlers assumed that Metacomet was the overall leader. But truthfully, each band fought under their own leaders. What makes this different than the Pequot War is that the natives had different weapons. They used flintlock muskets. They used English weapons, so the English did not have the technological superiority that they enjoyed in the Pequot War. The natives also began to attack entire towns and in large numbers kill women and children, just like the English. So they learned from their enemy. About 1/3 of New England natives actually allied with the English. So just like how in the Pequot you had Mohegan and Narragansett allies of the English, so too in King Philip's War, 1/3 of New England natives ally with the English. So it does become like a civil war. The English ultimately win because they enlisted the help of powerful Mohawk allies, and the natives simply ran out of supplies because the war is going to eliminate access to colonial traders. Now, ultimately, it might not seem like land is the driving force, but you have two cultures living side by side, often among each other. The English are starting to demonstrate that they simply want the natives gone, and they want the land for themselves. For our final conflict, we move to the colonial South, into what's called Bacon's Rebellion. And this is at about the same time as King Philip's War, the mid-1670s. Because in 1676, war is going to break out between a tribe known as the Susquehannock, who is an Iroquois tribe, just like the Six Nations today, and the Susquehannock fight frontier settlers. Now, the Susquehannock are very good at hit and run tactics, so the settlers demanded justice. That's where the initial conflict of colonists versus natives comes into play. Now, the Virginia governor, you can see him here, Governor Berkeley, didn't do enough to stave off native attacks. That was the charge that the frontier settlers were levying against him. You can see him on the left putting his coat on. These settlers said, hey, you're not doing enough to help us out. So a wealthier man named Nathaniel Bacon, pretty well connected, led this rebellion. That's where Bacon's rebellion gets his name. Now, the problem is that his forces killed natives who were friendly to the settlers. There were Algonquin tribes who traded with the English, and Governor Berkeley didn't like that. So that's where then it becomes a colonial civil war. Now, Bacon's forces attacked and burned Jamestown, and they were really gaining some momentum, but then he died of dysentery, and the movement fell apart. Now, this proves that common planters were not happy with the favoritism that the governor showed in giving out land. We've seen that the governor is directly appointed by the king. A lot of the time, the council are more well-connected individuals. This doesn't sit well with the free landowners. So again, it's about wanting more land. They feel like wealthy planters are getting too much of it. They're not getting a fair shake. So the English crown is going to start to take a more direct role in the colony. So again, 4 conflicts: conflict in Jamestown, Pequot War, King Philip's War, Bacon's Rebellion. What's the common factor? Land.